What do you do when you're being sued for defamation? Well, if you're CNN, you
double down with a little more defamation.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie getting ready for his afternoon nap. And for those of you who may not know, CNN is being sued by Twitter for defamation, and they filed their briefing in support of a motion to dismiss. And what they have alleged and stated in that briefing,
it's phenomenal.
The legal issues raised in CNN's brief in support of its motion to dismiss are nothing new. These are issues that we have seen time and time again in previous vlogs, previous motions to dismiss. What is singularly unique about CNN's brief in support of its motion to dismiss is that it is being sued for defamation. And what does it do in the introductory paragraph of its brief? More defamation. In the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, Atlanta Division, Project Veritas plaintiff versus Cable News Network Inc. defendant. Defendant Cable News Network Inc. CNN hereby files this brief supporting its motion to dismiss the complaint of Project Veritas PV. There is no dispute that Project Veritas was kicked off Twitter because it engaged in misconduct that endangered others. Nothing better than starting off your brief in support of your motion to dismiss a lawsuit for defamation by stating as allegedly undisputed a fact that is not only disputed, but that is itself utterly defamatory. CNN is starting off its brief in support of its motion to dismiss not by stating a fact that Project Veritas was in fact permanently suspended from Twitter for allegedly breaking some of the rules, which we will get to. They are starting off purporting that it is an undisputed fact that Project Veritas endangered others. This is not the best way to start a brief in support of a motion to dismiss an action in defamation. There is no dispute that Project Veritas was kicked off Twitter because it engaged in misconduct that endangered others. There is also no dispute that this occurred during a larger sweep by Twitter against posters of misinformation, and CNN reported about the two together. PV would have this court determine as a matter of law that there is a sufficient difference between getting kicked off for posting misinformation and getting kicked off for posting prohibited information to support a defamation claim by a public figure. There is not. Neither the First Amendment nor Rule 12 permit a defamation claim to proceed on such a hair-splitting distinction. CNN is actually arguing that it is a hair-splitting distinction as to the actual statements
for which one is being sued for defamation.
I'm going to play a clip of the allegedly defamatory statement in a second, but you just have to appreciate the argument that is being raised here. Project Veritas was in fact permanently suspended from Twitter, and the reason Twitter gave was that Project Veritas broke the rules as relates to doxing. CNN's Ana Cabrera goes on air and then claims that Project Veritas was actually kicked off of Twitter for spreading disinformation, and now they're arguing that there's no material difference between saying that Project Veritas was kicked off of Twitter for spreading disinformation as opposed to doxing. CNN is also raising the other standard legal arguments that Project Veritas has not sufficiently alleged actual malice, and as far as I'm concerned, those are probably the stronger arguments to raise on the motion to dismiss, but CNN is actually plausibly arguing that to the extent that the reason Twitter gave for the permanent suspension of Project Veritas was because of doxing, that it is therefore substantially true to say that they were kicked off for spreading disinformation. The complaint fails under basic free speech principles, and its defects are fatal. The commentary, the material aspects of which PV does not challenge as false, is, quote, substantially true, end quote, as a matter of state law and also as a matter of constitutional law, is not materially false. Additionally, as PV cannot show CNN subjectively doubted the truth of the commentary, PV cannot plausibly allege CNN published the commentary with the constitutionally required, quote, actual malice, end quote. The complaint should be dismissed now to protect, quote, robust reporting on public figures and events, end quote, ensure that free speech is not unduly burdened by the necessity of defending against expensive yet groundless litigation, end quote. Those are the legitimate questions of law, and before we get into the absurdity of CNN's defense as relates to the distinction or absence thereof of saying that Project Veritas was kicked off for spreading misinformation as opposed to kicked off for doxing, when I say that they double down on the defamation, wait until you read this paragraph. PV is a Virginia corporation with its principal place of business in New York. As reported in multiple outlets, PV is known for using ambush tactics, undercover, quote, sting, end quote, operations, and misleading and deceptive conduct that attempts to surprise, ensnare, and catch subjects making out-of-context comments in furtherance of PV's agenda. A small sample of the reported conduct includes 1. Plotting to set up FBI members on, quote, dates, end quote, with agents of PV to identify foes of former President Trump. 2. Covertly infiltrating daily CNN newsroom editorial calls and publishing audio of same. 3. Attempting to infiltrate the Washington Post. And 4. As alleged by researchers at Stanford University, running a, quote, disinformation campaign, end quote, during the 2020 election over alleged ballot harvesting. PV's founder, James O'Keefe, was convicted of entering a federal building under false pretenses businesses, and he and PV were reportedly barred from fundraising in several states. First things first, although the drafting of this paragraph would seem to suggest that James O'Keefe's conviction was somehow related to the 2020 elections, his conviction for having entered a federal building under false pretext dates back to 2010 and actually has nothing to do with the 2020 elections. Secondly, as relates to this alleged disinformation campaign, James O'Keefe is suing for defamation specifically on that issue as well as we speak. So in their brief in support of their motion to dismiss, CNN is raising allegations for which other people are currently being sued for defamation on the basis of the falseness of those statements. Well, setting aside the legitimate arguments in law, if I'm a judge and I'm reading this is already getting off to a bad start. But let's now get into CNN's absolutely absurd argument that when it comes to defamation in law, there is no legal distinction between saying someone was kicked off of Twitter for spreading misinformation as opposed to being kicked off of Twitter for the reason given by Twitter, that being allegedly doxing. Twitter bans Project Veritas. On February 11, 2021, social media platform Twitter, quote, banned, end quote, PV by permanently suspending PV's Twitter account for posting prohibited information. This is CNN itself in its brief confirming the reason that Twitter gave for the permanent suspension of Project Veritas. Now, how are they going to argue the rest of this? Twitter stated PV, quote, repeatedly, end quote, violated, quote, policies prohibiting the sharing or threats of sharing of other people's private information without consent, end quote. CNN, in its own argument brief, is confirming the fact that the reason Twitter gave for the permanent suspension of Project Veritas' account was that Project Veritas was allegedly engaging in sharing or threatening to share private information of third parties without their consent. And CNN is now going to argue that there is no difference between that and saying that Project Veritas was kicked off for spreading misinformation. CNN reports the ban and the broader spread of misinformation on social media. On February 11, 2021, CNN Business reported that PV's ban, quote, followed what a Twitter spokesperson described as repeated violations of the platform's policies prohibiting sharing or threats of sharing other people's private information without consent, end quote. CNN anchor and correspondent Ana Cabrera used substantially identical language while reporting the event on her Twitter account on the same day, the tweet. And as if CNN hadn't made enough potentially defamatory statements in this brief, they go on to say the following. Project Veritas has used this lawsuit as a vehicle to publicize itself and fundraise. In addition to publicizing the lawsuit on its website, PV published a music video about the Twitter ban and this lawsuit, and soliciting other defamation plaintiffs, and published a video accosting Miss Cabrera, threatening to depose her, and also trying to recruit her as a, quote, whistleblower, end quote. Well, James O'Keefe, Project Veritas, that music video seems to have struck a chord.
Pun intended.
The complaint does not identify a specific false statement of fact. Oh really, CNN? I mean, there is straw manning and then there is just outright gaslighting. Project Veritas specifically alleges that the defamatory statement, the factually incorrect defamatory statement, was that Project Veritas was kicked off of Twitter for spreading misinformation.
And of course, social media plays such a huge role here. We're starting to see companies crack down to try to stop the spread of misinformation and to hold some people who are spreading it accountable. Brian, for example, Twitter has suspended the account of Project Veritas, a conservative activist organization. At least that's how they couch themselves. This is part of a much broader crackdown, as we mentioned, by social media giants on accounts that are promoting misinformation.
CNN's argument here is that to the extent that the reason given by Twitter pertained to the doxing provisions of their terms of use, that in law there is no difference between that and saying that they were kicked off for spreading misinformation. The gist of the commentary that Twitter suspended PV's account amid a broader crackdown by social media sites remains the same, as the focus of the commentary was on social media's, quote, crackdown, end quote, to prevent misinformation and not on the details of Twitter's action against PV. In sum, the, quote, full truth, end quote, plaintiff wanted CNN to report would have no different effect on the viewer than what the commentary states. CNN is arguing that Project Veritas was kicked off of Twitter in the context of Twitter's broader crackdown on misinformation. Okay, that might be true. But in the context of the impugned commentary, CNN is certainly implicitly suggesting, if not outright stating, that the reason for which Project Veritas was kicked off of Twitter was because they too were spreading misinformation. And when it comes to a media outlet, there is a material difference between suggesting someone is spreading misinformation and someone may have doxed someone else on Twitter.
And of course, social media plays such a huge role here. We're starting to see companies crack down to try to stop the spread of misinformation and to hold some people who are spreading it accountable. Brian, for example, Twitter has suspended the account of Project Veritas, a conservative activist organization. At least that's how they couch themselves. This is part of a much broader crackdown. crackdown, as we mentioned, by social media giants on accounts that are promoting misinformation.
One accusation could put someone in violation of the terms of service and probably make them a very big jerk. The other one would make them fake news. And when it comes to a media outlet, that is a very, very big difference. And I hate arguing from analogies, but every now and again they serve a very useful purpose, and this might be one of them. Let's just say that on Twitter there was a broader crackdown on, let's just say,
Cheese pizza.
and in the broader context of Twitter's crackdown on cheese pizza, let's just say that Project Veritas was kicked off allegedly for violating the terms of service as relates to doxing. There is a very big difference between saying that Project Veritas was kicked off of Twitter for doxing versus suggesting in the commentary that they were kicked off in the broader context of the crackdown on cheese pizza. If that doesn't illustrate the absurdity of CNN's argument, nothing will. Let's move on to the legal arguments. Actual malice is a high burden imposed by the First Amendment and requires PV to plausibly allege CNN, quote, actually entertained serious doubts, end quote, about the commentary, or that CNN, quote, was highly aware that the account was probably false, end quote. In law, you are correct, CNN, and luckily for Project Veritas, in this very argument brief, you confirmed the fact, you confirmed your knowledge that the reason Twitter gave for the permanent suspension of Project Veritas had to do with doxing and not spreading of misinformation. CNN confirmed that fact in this very argument brief, so it's going to be virtually impossible for them now to claim that they did not know that their commentary was probably false when they made it. The linchpin of PV's actual malice theory is Ms. Cabrera's February 11, 2021 tweet concerning, quote, Twitter's stated basis for the Project Veritas ban, end quote. PV contends this tweet, quote, contradicts, end quote, the claim, quote, that Twitter banned Project Veritas for promoting misinformation, end quote, and demonstrates the latter statement was, quote, known by CNN to be false or made with reckless disregard for the truth, end quote. In reality, this theory alleges at most a foot fault, the at worst inadvertent omission of an immaterial detail, i.e. the specific reason for PV's ban when both Ms. Cabrera and Mr. Stetler were discussing a broader story on the recent social media, quote, crackdown, end quote, of enforcing rules to try to stop the spread of misinformation. Making a factually incorrect statement as to the specific reason Twitter gave for permanently suspending Project Veritas' account is not a foot fault.
That is the issue.
And if CNN made a factually incorrect statement as to the specific reason Twitter gave for banning Project Veritas, well, that is the defamation. Conclusion, the motion to dismiss should be granted with prejudice. Respectfully submitted this 15th day of June, 2021. So that is CNN's motion to dismiss. I cannot make any predictions on this motion because there are legitimate questions of law in this motion, but the fact that CNN has raised an utterly absurd argument will not help them. That and Project Veritas has been on quite the run recently with their W's, so I would not bet against them given that momentum, but I will be following up on this as soon as there is a judgment. And if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm.
More.
If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got standard support and merch. If anybody wants some merch, Robert Barnes and I do weekly streams every Sunday. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. We are on Locals. If you want to find us and support us there, you can find us at
VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
My content is also on Rumble if you want to watch it there, but more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!